colonization of Mexico ignited a merging of culture both socially and artistically, resulting in the development of religious structures that fused a variety of ethnic cultures together. The use of traditional European models as a base of inspiration, integrated with indigenous influence, created a cultural hybridity with the architecture of the New World, making the style unique to the new diverse culture. The inclusion of indigenous idolatry and styles reflective of the local environment allowed for the indigenous people to have a personal connection to the architecture. This documentary will explore the role of cultural hybridity played in the expression of the Baroque in the New World. To do this, we must first define hybridity. For our purposes, hybridity can be defined as the blending of elements of different cultures. We will explore the hybridity that occurred between Spanish colonizers and the indigenous people of Latin America. The results of this cultural crossover was expressed in the architecture and paintings. We will also look at artistic depictions of religious hybridity that resulted from Catholic Spain's attempt to convert the native population. The New World Baroque reflects many of the same qualities that are exhibited in the European Baroque. Although many of the techniques are very similar, this era in Baroque art, because of the diversity of cultures, evolved into its own groundbreaking movement. The stylistic characteristics of Baroque art began to spread from Spain to Mexico at the arrival of impactful Spanish artists due to Spanish colonization of the New World. As Spanish paintings and architecture began to circulate around the world, the art influenced a new wave of Baroque art. Mexican artists used Churrigueresque techniques as one of the foundations of their artwork. They created highly ornamented architecture, but with the use of a brighter color palette. The idolatry in churches closely resembled the indigenous people in Mexico, essential in bringing indigenous people into the Catholic religion. Indigenous input played a key role in creating architecture reflective of the colonial society. At first sight, the mixture of techniques between Spanish and New World may be hard to distinguish, but at a closer look, one can see the fluidity of the Baroque style being uniquely shaped. Indigenous and Spanish culture is successfully embodied through architecture, showing the influence of the mother country along with its reinterpretation that connects to the indigenous cultures. The architecture of New Spain held characteristics that were drawn from previous European models, though there is a large influence New World artists had in the development of these structures by adding their own styles to the architecture. Thomas da Costa Kaufman explains in Painting of the Kingdoms, A Global View of the Cultural Field, the arts developed in the Americas in ways which often cannot be so clearly related to European sources. Subjects which may seem to depend on European sources, but nevertheless are distinctive products of new milieu and that treat established genres in newer ways. It is important to recognize that although some features of the churches built throughout the New World were directly influenced by those in Spain, they uniquely held features that were influenced by the local culture. An example of the existing Spanish indigenous hybridity in architecture is the Church of San Francisco Acatepec in Pueblo, Mexico. From the outside, the church is covered by a highly ornamented facade consisting of various bright colors. The heavy ornamentation draws influence from the Churrigueresque style that was prominent in Spanish architecture, either through altarpieces or the decoration of the churches themselves. With the style developed during the Spanish Baroque, one clearly sees the European influence through the lavish ornamentation. However, San Francisco Acatepec is unique in that although it uses a Spanish style, the local culture is fused into the structure through the raw materials used to ornament the facade. The facade is covered by talavera ceramic tiles, a local material, rather than gold that was traditionally used in Spanish churches. Here, there has been a local adaptation to an already established model through the contribution of the natural materials around to ornament the facade. Other elements of European influence on the exterior of the church are the Corinthian columns around the entrance and the use of Solomonic columns that can be seen in Italian Baroque works such as Bernini's Baldacchino. These decorative European features, such as the Solomonic columns, estitepe, and cornices, coexist with the heavily ornamented facade, showing evidence that the church embodies the fusion of the old and new, through the merging of Spanish and Mexican Baroque characteristics. The interior of San Francisco Acatepec consists of stucco work done by indigenous craftsmen. The Churrigueresque style continues inside as the walls of the church are decorated by various figures. While Catholic imagery is prominent throughout the church, one can also see the colonial indigenous people in the process of actively transforming the culture that was placed upon them by including indigenous imagery through the stucco work. Blatantly, not indigenous figures, the craftsmen included minor details through the headdresses and hand positioning that implied the influence of their culture. Another example in San Francisco Catepec of indigenous idolatry is the sun featured on the ceiling that is an important symbol in both Aztec and Christian religions. The addition of their own iconography into the Catholic Church, an institution that was non-existent in the Americas prior to colonialization, shows the fusion of two cultures in order to appeal to the majority. Quote, Catholic architecture plays a role in the construction and representation of Poblano cultural identity, embodying not only the hegemony and influence of the Catholic Church, but also the ambiguous and complex identity of its people. Although pulling away from the European model, the cathedrals of New Spain were unique in that their style was influenced by both the new natural materials around them, along with the influence of the indigenous cultural aspect. The inclusion of indigenous idolatry into the Catholic Church was meant to appeal to the indigenous masses, however, was also a product of cultural hybridity and representative of the society at the time. Cultural hybridity is evident when observing the church of Santa Maria Tonantzitla, located. What is so unique about the architecture of this sacred space is the fact that the interior and exterior represent the idea of syncretism, or, quote, the process of absorption of Spanish cultural forms into the matrix of native Mexican culture. While incorporating characteristics of the Baroque that can be seen in decorations throughout the church, Santa Maria Tonantzitla ultimately leads the example of a successful combination of religiosity between Christianity and indigenous beliefs. The exterior, designed by Spanish Europeans, appears plain, flat, and lacks ornamentation. However, its Solomonic columns placed on top of the bell towers adds a sense of excitement. These columns appear to have been influenced by the Italian Baroque, as the Spanish incorporate similar stylistic aspects of Bernini's Baldacchino into this design. The interior is drastically different than the outside of the structure because of the way in which its ornamentation becomes so overwhelming. The amount of decoration provided a sense of comfort, as this was a church that was built for the average citizen. Inside Santa Maria Tonantzitla, a plethora of Christian and Mexican religious figures covers the walls and leave very little room for open space. Inside the North Chapel, the Virgin Mary and an altar devoted to St. Peter of Padua can be viewed, while the South Chapel consists of paintings depicting Christ's baptism and anecdotes relating to St. John's life. 16 Catholic saints appear on the walls of the church, while the altars and transepts are dedicated to the Passion of Christ and the wounds of Christ. The image of a dove hangs overhead in the middle of the dome, which represents the Holy Spirit. The dome itself symbolizes the sky of Tlaloc, known as the god of rain, and the angels that surround it represent the lives who were lost and have been ascended into Tlaloc's heaven. The figures themselves appear to resemble the likeness of indigenous people. Aldous Huxley, an influential writer, expresses his enthusiasm regarding the indigenous religious influences within the church by stating, quote, "And what stuccos! Some cherubs with Aztec feathers on the hair are watching us from the walls. On the vault above us, a group of Indian angels play violin." These feathers Huxley refers to represent the central Mesoamerican god, Quetzalcoatl, which is another way in which the indigenous people share their influences within the church. Local indigenous materials like flowers, fruits, and plants also appear within the church to make it a more relatable environment, and as a result contributes to the idea that Santa Maria Tonantzitlan was considered a familiar and comfortable space. Santa Maria Tonantzitla is an example of the way in which the Spaniards and indigenous people maintained their own set of beliefs. However, the combination between the two religions worked successfully when intertwined inside the church. When we think of the Spanish Inquisition, it is usually associated with a negative connotation because of the way the Spaniards treated the natives and forced them to forget their own beliefs and traditions within the culture. However, Santa Maria Tonantzitla reveals how both religions successfully fit together while maintaining their own aesthetic. One of the most prominent examples of cultural hybridity in the New World Baroque can be seen in depictions of the Virgin of Guadalupe. The iconography of the Virgin of Guadalupe is the result of cultural crossover between Catholic Spaniards and Mexico's indigenous population. Catholic doctrine teaches that the Virgin Mary is the mother of Jesus Christ, and her depiction is used to symbolize femininity and motherhood. The native Aztec beliefs feature a similar figure in the goddess Tonatzin, who was known as the mother of the earth. The figure of the Virgin of Guadalupe highlights the similar aspects these two religious figures share. This blending can be seen in the story of the Virgin herself. Quote, "She showed herself to a newly Christianized native, whose baptismal name was Juan Diego. Using the Aztec language of Nahuatl, the Virgin asked that a church be erected in her honor. Juan Diego tried 3 times to convince Archbishop Juan de Zumárraga of this apparition. He succeeded only on the last visit to Zumárraga, when roses tumbled out of his open tilmatli, or cloak, and a life-size image of the Virgin was found miraculously imprinted on its cactus fiber cloth. It is significant that the man who witnessed the Virgin of Guadalupe was a converted native." The Virgin's use of the native Nahuatl language and the symbolism of the tilma marry the Christian narrative with indigenous elements. To conclude, cultural hybridity is significant to the Baroque because of the way in which it combines various aspects of different cultures into works of art. By doing so, this allows viewers to experience multiple levels of diversity and introduces a new perspective on history. The Spanish Inquisition had many impacts on the indigenous culture, yet the works of art that were created during this time achieved the purpose of maintaining their own sense of identity. However, art was also a way in which both cultures were able to express their traditions and beliefs. This concept was expressed through architecture and paintings from Latin America. Overall, cultural hybridity allows for viewers to appreciate various characteristics of different cultures and influences the way in which we interpret the combination of these beliefs.